Hello and welcome back to the Schulich Startups Podcast, Episode 5. We're happy to be joined today by the CEO of For Founders by Founders, Cherry Rose Tan. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And my co-host, Vito Giovanetti,
Nice to meet you.
Schulich alumni, CEO founder of Treasured.
Thank you.
And we're excited to have a conversation with you today all about your organization, your business, and the campaign that you're working on across the country, and to talk about mental health for founders and entrepreneurs. So thanks for coming to have that conversation with us. Also excited to welcome you to Schulich. You're an incoming instructor for the winter term in social entrepreneurship. So we're excited to have you here and talk to you on both fronts. To kick it off, we'd like to talk to you a little bit about kind of the origins, the story, like what has made this mission that you're on to help entrepreneurs and to spread this campaign to get people talking about this. What has made this such an inspiration for you?
Thanks for asking, Chris. And by the way, just to let everyone know, super excited to be part of the Schulich community and to really contribute to entrepreneurship. So the story behind our movement For Founders by Founders started from a pretty personal place. So part of my story is that I come from a family of many entrepreneurs. So we're talking about like 5 generations of entrepreneurs. And it started off with, I remember growing up as a kid, growing up with a lot of stories about the family business. So like great-grandfather starting the first business in like the 1880s, which was a bakery at the time. And then through that inspiration, it became a lot of other businesses in the family. So stuff in clothing, real estate, food, and now in tech. And what was really interesting is that through my experience with entrepreneurship, like ever since I was like a young girl, like I knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like I was really stubborn about this and really inspired by a lot of the people before me, especially my family. And what was interesting about that experience is that I remember growing up, like my mom, my dad, we had a lot of conversations about how to build the business. So like, oh, this is how you protect your IP. Oh, like you should think about testing this part of your business idea. Oh, this is like, how are you going to wine and dine clients? So a lot of that conversation. But I think the one conversation that was missing, especially in my earlier years, was really the conversation around mental health. And it was really interesting when I started getting into entrepreneurship where at the time I felt like I was ready. Like I had read all the books, like I had gone to the conferences, talked to my parents, tested a bunch of stuff, studied and prepared as much as I could. But when I actually got into like becoming a founder, like it was really tough. And the part that I struggled with the most was like the mental health, the emotional health of like being a founder, in the tech world, having my first startup, spending every single like weekday, like during the nighttime, like going to networking events, trying to meet investors, telling people how epic my business was, but then kind of hidden in the shadows. It's like, it wasn't like that for me at all. It was really tough. It felt really lonely. And so I felt really inspired to do this movement, especially around 2 years ago, which is when we started. We're almost celebrating our 2-year anniversary. So 2 years ago, my family and I, we were in the crypto space, and it was a company that my brother and I had created together 7 years ago. So in that space of crypto, it's super stressful. Despite a lot of people thinking that's really glamorous, it's actually a lot of stress to like deal with banks and government and regulation, all kinds of things. And so back then, 2 years ago, so this is late 2017, like we were like up and coming, right? So a lot of people were saying, hey, you're pioneers in the space. We were talking to a lot of like national banks. Crypto was starting to become hot in the industry. And while that was happening, sort of like our meteoric rise to like, as a founder, my personal life was like heading towards a cliff. So, and this is something that's transparent and open. So like in 4 months, so this is in September 2017, I was in like a major car accident that was just very sudden and dealing with a lot of trauma, a lot of like just injury in terms of like back and like neck. So a lot of that. And then 3 months after that, my brother, who was the CEO of our company, he just suddenly passed away on Christmas. And it was very sudden, very random. And then 10 days after that, like my mom got diagnosed with stage 3C cancer. And this is while like our company, as I said, was like on the rise, and so many people were so excited about what we were building because we were like in the middle, we were about to do something at the national level. And so I share that only to say that in that experience, like in January of 2018, where it's like, wow, like I was going through so much loss and so much pain, and then still having to maintain our company, it was so stressful. And so that's what started the whole movement with For Founders by Founders of like the stuff with mental health.
Thank you for sharing that with us and being so open. Did you feel alone in those moments? And is that part of what you're looking to bring to people who might also be in those moments feeling alone?
100%. I mean, something that was really startling for me, and I'm actually surprised that it didn't hit me sooner, is that like a lot of my friends, a lot of my family, like are entrepreneurs, are founders. And it's interesting to be surrounded by so many people and yet have this feeling of feeling very alone, because back then it was hard for me to articulate and to be really honest about what I was going through. And part of it was that I was scared that people were actually going to judge me, especially because we have investors with the company. We were very public about what we were doing. We were speaking at a lot of conferences about all this amazing work we were doing. And so because I felt really alone at that time, what stood out for me was like, ironically, was also feeling like there's no way that I can be the only founder that's gone through some kind of this kind of magnitude of pain. Like there's got to be other people, across Toronto, maybe across Canada, who've gone through maybe grief or have gone through trauma. But where are these conversations?
Mm-hmm. And when you're in those moments being alone, I think to build on what you were just saying, whether you have investors, whether you have clients, whether you have staff, there's this world of people that are looking to be like a superheroine, to be like indestructible and ready to take on the world. And you probably felt like, and I know I felt like this at different points in my life and my journey as well too, that if I'm anything but like bright and shiny and armored and like ready to go and take on the world, then maybe I won't get that next client deal, or maybe that investor will lose faith and not sign the term sheet, or maybe that person I'm trying to recruit will decide that I don't know if I want to come work for someone. So you start like building all these like kind of like walls around yourself, right? And like, mass walls, armor that you put on, but it's getting heavier and heavier to wear as you go forward.
Right. Yeah, it's I think when you talk about the mask is something that I relate to a lot. And it's really fascinating just even seeing the dialogue around mental health. Like for example, when I talk to my parents, because they're also entrepreneurs as well, it's like that term, like imposter syndrome, that didn't exist back in their generation, right? And I think part of it is like, especially now with social media, there's even an added pressure now to feel perfect, right? To put out this image that's like no flaws, you're killing it at every part of your business, and you're kind of showing yourself off to whether it's VCs, angels, whoever it is that you want to attract to the business. Mm-hmm.
Well, here at the school, this is something that within the Schulich startup community that we've been really trying to have a deeper conversation about. And when we're having our VIP tour sessions and bringing in top entrepreneurs to meet with our founders, pretty much every time, that's one of the questions that the students or the recent grads are asking about. And Vito, you've heard that over and over again, haven't you, from people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the conversation for founders and entrepreneurs aspiring as well is, what resources and what advice can people that are battling mental health challenges like acquire to sort of help them work through these things. I had a question for you, which was more about the early onset of these kind of challenges. Like, are there certain approaches that you're recommending to founders to help them prevent their mental health from worsening? I think insights around that are where I think the conversation should go. as well, because right now it's really focused on people that have challenges currently.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I guess what I'm going to share is from my own experience, even though, I mean, for preface, like I have 12 years background in psychology. I have 2 certifications in coaching. So I'll say it from personal experience, but also from my own expertise. I think the big thing with mental health is that, so the reason why I do this movement, and for people who don't know, so like my movement, what we do is like, we call ourselves the mental health movement for the tech industry, and right now we're in North America to start. We'll be taking over the world soon. But my movement, like we have 70 tech CEOs that are part of this movement right now that are public, and we have another 130 that I call kind of like the hidden supporters. And the main part of what people know us for is that we create content that's very, very unique. So we capture the human stories of these CEOs. So imagine like, especially I think when I was young, like I had all these idols of all these founders I wanted to become. So imagine like seeing like your idol, but instead of hearing their glory story about how they IPO'd their company for like $500 million, like the story that you get from us is their human story. Like you actually get to see them unmask and be like, okay, like for example, who is James as a person? Like how did James grow up? Like what does he value in life? What's a moment where he felt like he couldn't sleep at night, and how did he actually deal with it? And so in relation to your question, like, I think a lot of times with mental health, I like to say like it's important to have distinctions. So, I've been very public in the tech industry that growing up, so from ages 10 to 20, I struggled with depression and also anxiety. And my anxiety was so bad that like I couldn't even speak in front of groups, right? Like I couldn't speak in front of groups, had a stutter, like it was really debilitating for me. And the thing is like a lot of people who are actively going through like their mental health experience, like, speaking from my own experience with depression, it's like, how to describe it? It almost feels like you're drowning. Like that's the feeling of it, like when you're in the most intense stage of it. And so the distinction that I have right now, even in my own experience, because I'm still going through grief, is that there's a difference between like suffering and pain. Like to be honest, like especially for founders who are listening to this, entrepreneurs, leaders, like pain is a universal part of life, right? Like I didn't expect the losses that we had in my family, but part of the things I had to make peace with is like, you know what, like the reality is there are people out there that we're going to lose. There's companies that eventually we're going to part with. There's all kinds of things that always happen in transition with life. But the part that I think I encourage people to sort of, take the first step is like, even if you're in the deepest part of your pain, how can we start making peace with it? How can we start doing the work around like being able to like love ourselves and look at our story in a different way, right? So a lot of, pain is universal, but suffering doesn't have to be. And, when it comes to mental health, and I know a lot of people who are in the midst of it can relate to this, the part that I think hurts us the most is like, for example, if you're going through depression, which, I had this experience like in the midst of it, like back then, was like, okay, like I'm going through depression. And then on top of that, there's this layer of suffering because I'm telling myself, oh, like, look at me, like I'm broken. Look at me, I'm not good enough. Look at me, like I disappointed all the people around me. And so oftentimes when I talk about mental health, like the big thing that I tell founders, and I don't mean this as a cheesy way, it's like, how can we build practices, or I want to be particular about the words, rituals where we're actually giving ourselves self-care and giving ourselves love. And I say this because a lot of people, when people hear the word self-care, because it's like a buzzword now, people say, oh yeah, like, of course I take care of myself. Like people will often go to that default answer. Mm-hmm. But when you actually look deeper into that, it's like, do you really put yourself first? And even for me, like that's something that I continue to be on that journey of where, for example, even just in this past year, sometimes there's a temptation where I know that my industry, a lot of people keep telling me like, okay, like your movement, like we're almost like depending on you to see this through, that we can have conversations on mental health. And I know there's people in my industry who struggle. But at the same time, like, I have to take care of myself. And there's the temptation of like, oh, maybe like this month I'm going to work 80 hours a week, right? Like sometimes that thought comes into my mind. And then I have to stop it. I have to tell myself, you know what? Like, I could do that. I could be a workaholic. But if I truly love myself enough and I care about myself enough, then I will allow myself to actually slow down and take care of myself first so that I can really serve my community.
One of the areas that it seems to me that in order for this to really like take hold, we have to get this message into also the investment community and the venture capital community, to the boards of these companies, so that when they're connecting with and interacting with these founders, that they have a larger sense of what are the various ways that the company is healthy, and that the company being healthy is deeply connected to the founder being healthy as well too. I'm just curious about, like, as you've gone out, are there any parts of the industry where there's like any, like, resistance to this? Like, we all still need to be like heads down 1,000%, like doing whatever we have to do to scale as far and fast as we can? Or are you seeing some of these other areas where people are starting to recognize that there's like a benefit to the mental health in terms of the actual performance of the company as well too? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I actually think it's a mixed bag right now in the industry. Like I almost feel like that conversation's emerging, and depending on let's say, which accelerator you're in, or which, let's say, VC firm you're talking to, some are more progressive than others. So for example, like what's fascinating to me is in the States right now, there's actually a lot more conversation happening with mental health and tech, right? So for example, there are VC firms in the States that have been very open about being founders first. Like, I'm talking about like Alpha Bridge Ventures that has an in-house psychologist, Andreessen Horowitz, who say they're founders first and actually practice that. They're very, very forthcoming about actually like mentoring their founders and being very real with them. And what's interesting, I think, in Canada, because sometimes there's a little bit more being conservative with about like taking like really interesting risks and things like that, that I think we're a little bit newer in that conversation around mental health. And it's not to say, and just to preface, it's not to say that people are against mental health. Like that's the interesting thing. Like when I started having these conversations, so I speak at a lot of these like big tech conferences, and I'm usually the one who's opening up the conversation for the first time for that particular community. So people will ask us to do that. And what's interesting is sometimes people in the audience, especially founders or directors, people who work on these startups, they feel, or there's sometimes an anger feeling like, oh, like the VCs, they don't care about us, they don't care about mental health, they're pressuring us to work 100 hours a week. But when I talk to VCs, I get a very different story from them, where what they reflect to me, it's like, of course we want to help our founders because like we're investing in the founders, right? Like if you're making money, we're making money. But what they feel is like they feel like they're looking at a black box where it's like, I think something's going on with the company, but I don't know what it is because the founder isn't telling me. And so I see that on both sides, at least for me, that founders and investors are both saying, hey, like we actually want to have a little bit more honest conversation. But it's also something that at the moment feels a little bit shy and feels a little bit more vulnerable because it's so new.
Interesting. Are there any people in the space that you'd suggest to alumni and students to follow that are thought leaders in this area?
When you say thought leaders, like, are we talking about like founders or investors, or do you mean more broadly in like the mental health field?
Yeah, maybe a bit of both, actually. Yeah, like for founders looking to somebody that is going through this and having open conversations with their investors could be helpful to some, but also just like community leaders, I think, would be great.
Yeah, any founders that are like, doing a good job of living with that transparency and succeeding at the same time.
Right. That's a good question. I think one that I really like in terms of we're talking about VCs is Real Ventures. They're actually here in Toronto. They've been amazing supporters of our movement, especially shout out to Janet and JS, because they are in a place right now with their firm where they're talking a lot about like conscious capital, and they're talking about, okay, when we invest, like, are we making sure that we're asking the right questions? And Janet in particular, who was one of our first champions, I mean, she has been very, very vocal. She speaks at tech conferences or hosts panels on mental health. And she's one of the few right now, I think, in the VC world. So it's great to have her. I think the other thing as well is that, I mean, so I think a good resource as well actually is our website. So it's like pledgeyourstory.com, which is where we aggregate all of the different like stories around like different CEOs, because I don't want to out anybody here, like let's say on the podcast. I mean, they're all very public about their stories, but the stories that we've collected, you'll notice that a lot of them started off from the Toronto ecosystem. Like there are people that have pledged to us who are VCs. There's people who are founders who are still actively in that space. We have people who are founders who have now exited. We have founders turned investors. And what's interesting, for example, a lot of those people are now becoming more open with their stories as well. And it's stories about like sharing about depression or anxiety or stuff about, you know, whether it's grief or about what is it like to run a company while they're going through like a breakup. So it's a lot of that as well.
We're, in addition to having you on campus talking with people about your movement and about the campaign, we're also really excited to have you joining us as an instructor in the winter term and
Yes.
Teaching the undergraduate course in social entrepreneurship. And I know that's got like a special place in your heart, Schulich, and the opportunity to come into the classroom. And you're looking to create a pretty special environment for your students. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be to be teaching the social entrepreneurship course at Schulich. And I obviously really thank you, and I also thank just like the Schulich community for really inviting me and welcoming me with open arms. One of the things, so Chris, I mean, when you and I chatted, I mean, one of the things I mentioned to you, and it's funny, like we didn't talk about this the first time we met, but it's like education's such a big passion of mine. Like even before I was a tech founder, I was an educator first. And it's because like when I was going through the deepest parts of my mental health experience, the person that changed my life was my grade 8 teacher. Like if it wasn't for him, like to be honest with you, like I don't know where I'd be. And I really see that like how teachers can really impact and change people's lives. And so with this course with social entrepreneurship, like I've been really thinking about, okay, like if this is me back in undergrad, now having the experience I have as a founder, like what are all the things that I would love to know? So I'm really excited, especially with this course, to bring in like the most epic founders or investors to come in and be guest speakers, really talking about just like real life stories about what it's like to be a founder, and also really tying it into this idea about like social purpose. Because where I see right now on the planet, and I love that this course is here at Schulich, is that social entrepreneurship is really like the big and upcoming thing. Like I think we're seeing this right now, especially in the media, where there are so many people who are creating companies, but the mission is so important, right? Especially this upcoming generation, like the younger generation. They don't just want to work at any company. They want to work at a company or create a company that is really doing good in the world. And so I'm really excited to be able to teach that.
Well, we're excited to have you with us, and your company is one of those companies that's doing good in the world, and we're lucky to have you in Toronto and also behind you to spread that word to startup communities around North America and eventually around the globe. I'm sure there's a lot of people here on campus, students, alumni, who would love to get involved and support what you're doing. So in terms of the pledge, in terms of supporting you online, where should we follow you?
I mean, for the movement, best place to follow us is pledgeyourstory.com is where you'll see like all of the stories we've collected from these amazing tech CEOs. And the handle, the social media handle, Pledge Your Story, it applies for like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, so all of those things. And then in terms of if you're following me personally, then it's like Cherry Rose Tan at Twitter, for that one.
Okay, well, we'll put that word out for all the students and grads to see how they can help out and get involved and get behind the movement. And all you undergrads, make sure you sign up for Cherry Rose's course. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here. And we'll look forward to the next episode of the Schulich Startups Podcast. Vito, Cherry
Sure.
Rose,
Yep.
thank you.
Shout out all the teachers.
Thank you.
Thanks.